Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu, melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
I mean,
And here we are in the midst of the Ten Commandments. That's what we're doing. We're in the middle of it. And we're talking about the Shabbat, about the commandment to observe the Shabbat. V'zacharta ki evet hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim, and you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. V'yotziacha Hashem Elokecha misham, and the Lord your God took you out of there biyad chazakah, with a strong arm, a strong hand, with zroa netuyah, and an outstretched arm. Those, of course, think about those metaphors, right? Hand, of course, power, right? Power, control. Azra, arm outstretched, meaning I have a sense of from a distance in a way, right? When you have to stretch your arm to go do something. In other words, you know, not that it takes effort for God, but from our perspective, understanding how difficult that is for that to happen. Al ken sivcha Hashem. For this reason, the Lord Adonai Elohecha, the Lord your God, has commanded you la'asot et yom Shabbat, to practice the day of Shabbat. And I want to say that if you look back at Exodus, the reason for observing the Shabbat there is different from the reason given here. The two commandments, those two sets of 10 commandments, are not identical. There are slight variations, and this is not so slight a variation, where in the first it is creation, it's that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and in seventh day he rested. That's why God wants us to. And in this particular case, it has to do with the fact that originally we were slaves and God took us out. I'll take a look at the Rashi and I'll comment a little bit more. V'zacharta ki evet hayita, and you shall remember that you were a slave. Almanat came, and for this reason, Peda'acha, he has redeemed you, he has rescued you. She'tiyeh lo evet, that you should be a servant or a slave to him. Ve'tishmor mitzvotav, and you should observe his commandments. And actually, what Rashi is saying here in this relatively brief commandment is actually a profound principle. That if has to do again with how mindful we are about what we're reading here and whether we accept this at all and to what degree we choose to follow the Torah, but to recognize that we actually have a profound and moral obligation to perform these mitzvot because of this. Now, there's something that I realized relatively lately, something I did not realize. So I have tended on the whole to sort of, I think it's a fairly common approach to see the Torah somewhat more historically than, but as you know, more recently I have seen it much more as literature and found a great deal of meaning and joy in looking at the Torah as literature. And to see the land of Egypt, slavery in the land of Egypt, as actually being a profound metaphor. Not to say that there may well be some historical grounding in this, but the truth is, I think, that we all face slavery in Egypt. That Egypt is actually a metaphor for the various types of addictions that we have. That Mitzrayim is the nature of an addiction. And so often, just like an addiction, it starts so innocently, and before you know it, it's a rope around your neck, or in the tradition, they talk about a snake that is swallowing you up alive. That it starts off as fine as a spider's web, you know what I mean, as the thread of a spider, and then winds up as this heavy snake on you. And likewise, initially, the experience of the Jewish people in the land of Egypt was very light. Yes, Lauren, I can stop now and continue.
um, I just wanted to point out that addiction doesn't necessarily mean something external like substance abuse or television, but it could be some like childhood defenses that you had used and can't stop using as an adult, but they're not serving you, or, a way of thinking about yourself in relation to other people that's not serving you well, but it's natural because it's how you grew up. And it's, addictive in the sense that it's habitual in a way that's difficult for us to control.
Right.
And
Yes, I agree.
and so I just wanted to point that out, that there's all kinds of addictions, that some of them are somewhat self-created. You can't blame yourself if you were a child that needed those defenses, but you can take responsibility for the fact that only you, sometimes with God's help or with a therapist's help or both or whatever, can change that.
Right. There's no excuse. It is very often when we're talking about this. I totally agree, Lauren. Sometimes that addiction can be anger. Sometimes that addiction can be using illness as a secondary gain. There are all kinds.
Defensiveness,
Yes, of course. Um,
entitlement.
those things can become addictive. The point about the addiction, and by the way, I also think there are good addictions, but you have to, so for example, and when I think of addiction, I think of something that is deeply, deeply emotional, it lies deeply within the psyche. So that if you, for example, love praying or love to study or love to perform acts of charity, etc. At this point for me in my own life, I love Shabbat morning and I love davening. And the reason I do it is less out of a sense of duty than out of a sense of wanting some possible appropriate way to thank God for the blessings that I feel, miraculous blessings in some cases, and probably all of the miraculous blessings that I feel I experience in my life day by day. And because the prayers are so ancient and they come so much as a expression of my tradition, I love formal worship in that sense. And it's become, I don't know that one would necessarily call it that I'm addicted to it, but at least I want to open that as a possibility. And
Well,
that's
I wouldn't call it addiction, because I think addiction implies that it's hurting you somehow.
correct.
And
But
if it's benefiting you, then it's just a good habit. It's
I,
something that's helpful. It's something you want to do partially because how helpful it is to you. And addiction is something that catches you and restricts you, and it makes you have a hard time doing things that are good for yourself because you're addicted to something that's holding you back.
yes, I agree. Addiction does have, I'm glad you are bringing this out. Addiction does have a negative connotation. I was thinking as I was listening to you, that also in some ways, addiction is so strong that it is so hard to resist it through rational means, that it's very, very difficult to face it like that. And for me, of course, it's a love. It's what it is. Um, so there was something else so here's the thing. The idea, the notion that being brought out of Egypt is successfully being able to get out of the addiction. And that is coming out of Egypt. And in that sense, every single one of us has an Egypt or Egypts to have to deal with. I suspect that for most of us, it probably is possibly one major addiction that may, in fact, bear with it the roots of other problematic behaviors, and that if we are able to stop that essential addiction, where it's easier for us to stop some of the other negative behaviors. But seeing slavery in Egypt in this metaphoric sense, personalizes it. It's no longer a historic event that took place 3,000 years ago or more, but rather something that, in fact, we face every moment, and was one of the reasons why I feel that walking away from our tradition is actually hurting us, and having, finding a way in which to live lives that are fulfilled and healthy and purposeful. And of course, these days, my sense is that every single person is seeking some sense of significance, that we all have ways to find it. Yes, Lauren, go for it.
I understand why the metaphor is Egypt is addiction, but I don't like the fact that it uses Egypt because it's a beautiful land and a beautiful culture and a beautiful people. And what I'm more comfortable with is like translating the word Egypt as best as you can into something related to narrowness.
Yes, I
And
yes, agreed. I think that's the reason why that word is picked, and also because it provides a setting for a narrative. But I agree. Interestingly enough, though, I haven't sensed, despite this and the validity of your point, a tendency to look down on Egyptians because of this. I don't necessarily see that. That honestly,
But imagine though, if you were an Egyptian and you're reading this or hearing people, during the Passover or whatever, and it feels demonizing to you. It feels like they're the other.
right.
Would you want an Egyptian? Would an Egyptian feel comfortable at your Seder table?
Good.
And
Yes. Yes.
if not, then my preference is, not to use this text, because even if you're talking about, first of all, I don't really think it's so historical, but secondly, if you're talking about an event, historical or fictional, in which Jews were enslaved by Mitzrayim and by the ruler of it, you can always look at that as, enslaved by something that's tightening and narrow, and the Pharaoh, I know there's a whole story about Joseph and Potiphar and all the stuff that leads into it, and but then you get to the bad Pharaoh, and that's what is the part that comes out in the Passover story. But you can kind of look at that as your own, bad Pharaoh, the dictator, that's
Absolutely.
imposing upon you as yourself.
So I recognize the point that you're raising, that if you were to have an Egyptian at your Seder, which is a wonderful illustration of the point that you're making. And I think, though, I would like to at least say that a couple of things. One is that it's possible that it begs an explanation. Say the Seder is supposed to be about explaining things and explaining that we aren't demonizing. The idea is not to demonize Egypt, and that we don't just have a bad story about Egypt, right? And nor is it trying to demonize the Egyptians. In fact, there's statements that talk about, where it says you cannot marry into the Amalekites, etc., or something, whoever these particular people. But it says, the third generation can marry into the Egyptians, and it says because they were kind to you. There's also, remember, when we pour out, when we're saying this, the plagues, where we pour out the joy, right, the blood, etc., the wine that represents the blood. So I think those are important things. And the other thing that was I was thinking was that the Jewish people themselves are not somehow saved from criticism. That in some ways it just brings out even a greater level of a lack of appreciation on the part of the Jewish people who went into exile for 2,000 years. I mean, we face that. And I think it's so important, though, to have these descriptions and not walk away from metaphors that may at least, be open then to discussion, et cetera, et cetera. But please know, I'm not walking away from your essential point, which is I agree with you 100% that I don't want to demonize any person or any nation or religion or race or anything. I think that is,
But
and the potentials are there. There's no doubt about
but
it.
not just the potential. The reality is that a large percentage of the Jewish community is quite willing to demonize. And
I
I know people will tell me, okay, but we have real enemies. But my opinion is, when we think of people as enemies, we can do things to them that turns them into enemies,
right. That
even
that
if they wouldn't have been enemies naturally.
or we can pour gasoline on it as well. Okay, and we see that happening. Right.
Well, yeah, it starts somewhere, and to say that it started with this or that is, kind of always ignoring whatever came before it.
Of course, and we know that's going on right now. We recognize that. I know.
That it's making me uncomfortable to go to shul.
I'm sorry about that. Yes, I hear you.
I
I
mean, it's not that I go to a shul that's not somewhat liberal and where everybody's demonizing people, but it is so prevalent that it's all about, them versus us and how we feel, and there's no attempt to understand
right.
a challenging narrative. And I can't stand the one-sidedness, and it's just so pervasive in the Jewish community right now.
That's
And I just
right.
it alienates me. It alienates the heck out of me.
Yeah. Well, being patient and trying to, respectfully disagree in these particular cases.
Can't do that because people get really, really angry.
Yeah, I know.
No matter how gently you try to approach something, it upsets them.
Yeah.
And they deny the truths of what you're saying. They say they
Yes.
say that I'm the one brainwashed. I'm the one that's been propagandized.
That's of course, of course, of course. Let me steer this back to our text, okay? Yes, I hear you. Right. So, going on, with kabed et avicha ve'et imecha. So honor your father and your mother, kasher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha, just as the Lord your God commanded you, lema'an yarichun yamecha, in order that your days may be long. Ulaman yitavlach, and in order that he do well by you, right, that he do good by you, al ha'adamah, on the earth, asher Adonai, or the land, I think it's earth, asher Hashem Elokecha noten lach, which the Lord your God is giving you. Interestingly, right, it's been pointed out that this is the only mitzvah in the Ten Commandments where there, and in fact, in general, there are very few mitzvot where a reward is attached to them. But here, a reward is attached. And there's a question that this begs because it says, as the Lord your God has commanded you. And Rashi gloms onto that, right? Kasher tzivcha, as he commanded you. So the question is, where? Where? Sanhedrin. So this is a reference, of course, to the Talmud, Sanhedrin, Tractate Sanhedrin, page 56. Af al kavod ava em nitzvavu mamara. So the idea we have actually dealt with this before, and that is that prior to the giving of the Ten Commandments, this is in Parshat Beshalach, right after the crossing of the Red Sea and the battle against Amalek, we read about the manna, right, and the commandments given along with that. And there's a tradition that a number of commandments were already given in at Mara, and this is one of them, that the of honoring your father and your mother. By the way, while I'm going to sort of sub edit the point about father and putting father in front of mother, and back in Leviticus chapter 19. In Kedoshim, it talks about, it says, fear your mother and your father. And there's a very important point to underline a principle that you've heard me say more times than you can shake a stick at, which is that the Torah is doing what doesn't come naturally. And that's the point that the commentators make, that it's more typical to honor your mother rather than your father because of how your mother treats you. And at least for boys, maybe it's the other way around for women. But anyway, but on the other hand, you're likely less to fear your mother than your father, and that's why it puts mother first when it talks about fearing. So at least in the principle is there. So anyway, going back to the issue about having commanded about honoring your father and your mother back in Mara, and you have to look at the proof text that Rashi is going to say. Shinemar, as it says, and it does say, I went back to examine this, back in Exodus chapter 15, Sham Sam Lo Chok Umashpat. There he gave him a edict and laws, right? So I went back to check it out. Of course, the verse is there, and of course that's that reference to the idea of at least some of the Torah being given already anticipated there. However, it didn't say a word about honoring father and mother. And it must be that it is a tradition that goes along with those things, or whether that in some sense, perhaps it's suggesting that the Ten Commandments, and I'm really going on a limb here, were somehow anticipated, and that's why it's included them here. Certainly, the whole story about the manna underscores Shabbat and the idea of observing Shabbat. And the fact that it does that might well give us a suggestion that other laws from the Ten Commandments were given back then and anticipated. But to the extent that I was able to do research, that's what I did find out. But in the final analysis, that's where God already commanded the Jewish people regarding honoring their father and their mother. And I think a lot more could be said about this whole principle that in fact, in general, again, you know, doing what doesn't come naturally, because we know that it's a natural part of a natural process of gaining a certain level of independence and adulthood is to in a sense become independent from your parents and find ways to do that. That's actually a healthy process, but the question is, how do you do it in a balanced way which is healthy and nevertheless still show respect and love for your parents and at the same time be able to develop one's own level of independence? Just saying it's an interesting thing. And the idea that society itself, right, in the reward that's associated with this particular commandment, that it's a pillar of society too. So going on a little bit more with the Ten
Just a
Commandments.
sec.
Oh,
A sec.
Judith. Yes, Judith, welcome.
Hi. Um, so now I can't remember. I'm sorry.
No
All right.
problem. Okay, don't go on mute, and if you think of it, just raise your hand again, okay? And I will try and recognize you in the time we have left. We have a little bit of time. So going on, lo tirtzach, you shall not murder, velo tinaf, you shall not commit adultery, velo tignov, and you shall not steal, velo ta'aneh bereacha eid shav, and you shall not I would say, testify against your neighbor, against your fellow, false witness, with false witness. And let's take a look at the Rashi here, velo tinaf. It's a point that we've made before as to the definition of adultery. Ein lashon ni'uf. He says that the term ni'uf in Hebrew, ela be'eshet ish, it refers to a married woman, a married woman. So we've talked about this before. It doesn't mean that there's implied permission of engaging in relations, in sexual relations with other women that are not married. It is simply saying this is one of the Ten Commandments. And of course, this whole notion of 10 commandments, because we know there are actually 603 other commandments that Jews are commanded to observe. Why are 10 singled out like this? And I'm sure that there's been a lot of ink spilled on that subject. I've certainly thought about it myself. I recently learned that apparently Nachmanides sees them uh, as sort of saying, well, if you can't do this, at least do this, and if you can't do this, at least do this, going all the way down to the 10th. My sense is that in some ways, even if you don't observe the other commandments, these 10 have a particular significance in some sense or another. Possibly to say that you're part of of being a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That in that sense, if you observe these things, and just let's see if there's anything else that I want to add about this. Yes. Thou shalt not steal. In the halachic midrashim, it is mentioned that thou shalt not steal refers to kidnapping. That the idea is that every one of these particular commandments is in fact a capital issue, right? That in some sense, that if it's a negative commandment, it's a capital offense. And even though in some cases, so for example, the very last commandment, which we're going to get to in a moment, there's no court that can really adjudicate such a situation. It is the Torah is trying, even sometimes it may use what I think is legitimate hyperbole to try and get our attention and to try and get us to be mindful. The lack of mindfulness, I think, is a very serious kind of thing. So, last commandment, lo tachmod eshet re'echa, right? You shall not desire, right? You shall not covet is the way it's usually translated. Your neighbor's wife. V'lo titaveh beit re'echa. You shall not desire your neighbor's or your fellow's house. Sadehu, his field, va'avdo, his servant, va'amato, his maidservant, shoro, his ox, v'chamoro, or his donkey, v'chol asher l're'echa, or anything that is your neighbor's. And we realize just how foundational that is, right? In some senses, this was the commandment that Cain did not. He was clearly jealous of Abel, and this idea of jealousy and being a cause of all kinds of problems, etc. So, velo tit aver. So Rashi's discussing this. Lashon says tirug. It has the meaning of desire. Afhu lashon chemda. And it too, right? It says lo tachmod. That's the Hebrew that it used there. It is also has to do with the idea of coveting, right? Desiring. And it says nechmad lemarot, right? Desirous of, this is referring to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Nechmad lemar'eh, right? It looked desirable. Umitargaminan, and there the Targum, the Aramaic, is the mergad lemechazeh. So there's that root ragag, right? Lo tirug is the Aramaic there, having to do with desire, being desirable. So I think that is it for the Rashi right now, and we will end here today. Judith, if you thought of what the point was you wanted to make, please feel free to share that before I end the recording.
Yes, I did remember.
Wonderful.
You were speaking of I don't know, separating into your own human being, and I think that this is a current concept, and certainly applies, certainly the way we think today. But I don't know how that would have played out then. I mean,
Sorry.
you went from one group allegiance to another.
Yes. Sorry, I misunderstood the initial point you made. Separating into yourself. I'm not sure I understood
You were
what you were.
talking about, this is about honoring your parents,
Yes.
fearing your mother, and
Yes.
um, that a certain amount of separation is
Oh,
set.
I see.
Integrating.
Right,
But
gaining
I,
independence. Yes,
but
yes.
I think that that's a modern concept.
Hmm. I
It
don't know. I mean, I sort of maybe I'm mistaken, and I'm so convinced by modern psychology, if that's what it is, as seeing it as simply a natural process. I mean, it seems to me that it's just part of it's not something that we do consciously or necessarily culturally either. I think it's simply part of a natural process of growth in the human being. But that as human beings we have far more flexibility as to how we actually do that. But I mean, animals have to learn how to be independent as well. That's part of becoming an adult. So
but I think you're both right, because if you look at the way animals become independent, it's not like so much of an attitude. It's just, learning to imitate what their parents do so that they can be, know, they can live independently of their parents. Even just like weaning is a part of learning how to live independently of your parents. But what Judith is saying, currently it's more of an attitude. that goes with it. I think in the old days, it may be that when children were becoming adults, they were maturing, but they were imitative of what their parents were. They were learning the trades. They were doing the things that would make them be able to live even after their parents were gone. But it wasn't this attitude of this is a separate type of person, this thing we called a child.
Yes.
And
Yeah. Oh, I know
in
that they used to
various
look at
ways.
children. Sorry,
It
Lauren.
certainly was no adolescence.
My understanding is that the attitude before was that children were simply young adults, that they did not see childhood as a stage or maybe adolescence as a stage. I'm not sure. I don't, I haven't done enough research to be able to argue that,
Yeah, so there's certainly a move toward independence for any given um, animal,
right.
people included, but it's a different kind of thing in modern times. So I think you're both right.
Yeah. Okay. Very rabbinic, Lauren. And on that wonderful note, I'm going to end today's session.
No, it was Fiddler on the Roof.
Okay. All right.